watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed that this episode is a week delayed. But if you want to get early access to our episodes, consider becoming a paying member. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you for all your support. I interviewed Alister McGrath for my Channel 4 documentary, Root of All Evil. He's a theologian, a nice enough fellow, but I wouldn't go out of your way to listen to this interview unless it's to remind yourself what an empty, vacuous, non-subject theology is. Oh. Hello, nice to see you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. As you see, I'm doing my homework. I have actually read it before and greatly enjoyed it. Well, Alister, for an apologist for religion, to be able to say that you once were an atheist gives you a certain amount of street cred, which not everybody can boast. Could you tell me a bit about your journey from that position to where you are now?
Well, I think when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, I did feel very strongly that religion was something that caused violence and difficulties. And certainly, I think growing up in Northern Ireland, you could see how easy that would have been to be the case. And back in the 1960s, of course, everybody was a Marxist, and I followed that intellectual fashion. And so it just seemed entirely reasonable to adopt an atheist approach. And of course, at the time, I was studying the natural sciences, wanting to go and study chemistry at Oxford. And again, it just seemed to me that the sciences and atheism almost, if you like, rolled into each other in a very intellectually satisfying way. I think when I arrived at Oxford, I began to rethink things. I began to realise they weren't perhaps as straightforward as I thought. And certainly it was at that point that I really began to feel that Christianity offered a better way of seeing things and making sense of things than I'd imagined in the past.
Right, thank you. This is sort of coming to the end of a fairly long period of interviewing people. And in America and in Israel, I've interviewed some fairly, what should we say, odd bedfellows of yours. And I sort of feel I ought to give you the opportunity to say something reasonable, because I've interviewed people who said, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give birth to a man. Or I've interviewed somebody who thought that it was right that adulteresses should be stoned to death. I mean, how do you feel about being, in a sense, in the same camp as people like that?
I think any member of a group, whether it's religious or anti-religious, obviously finds themselves in company that they might feel at times rather uneasy about. For example, many atheists would be alarmed at some of the violent ideas you find in other atheists. And I certainly do find myself concerned about some of the more extreme views, some of the more violent views I find amongst religious believers. And certainly I would want to try and emphasize the fact that Christianity is a rational faith, that it certainly believes very strongly in God, but it also believes that we can make sense of the world, and therefore to engage in dialogue with people like you is immensely important, partly because it advances understanding, but also because in principle it is extremely important to be critiqued by people with alternative viewpoints in case we've missed something.
Yes. Well, I've been trying to engage in dialogue and repeatedly was brought up short by the fact that there was no dialogue to be had, because at some point the trump card of faith is produced. And there is no arguing with that. Now, I know that in this book, you take me to task for my, as you think, misunderstanding of faith. And I wonder if we could talk about that a bit. I have said that faith is not based upon evidence, but is what you need when there isn't any evidence. And as soon as there's any evidence, then you don't need faith anymore. And you have possibly rightly criticized me for not taking sufficient account of the way Christians have actually defined faith. And I understand that. I understand that the way Christians define faith does not correspond to the way I define faith. However, I don't understand where you're coming from when you do say something like faith is based upon reason. I mean, what kind of reason, what kind of evidence do you use to support your faith?
Well, I think that's a very fair question. And certainly, I'd want to say immediately that we're talking about a slightly different situation than, for example, evidence that the moon orbits the Earth a certain distance. I think that one of the big questions one has when one tries to make sense of anything that is big, for example, what is the meaning of life, why we hear things like that, is that there are many explanations. And inevitably, this means we have to try to do what Gilbert Harman described as infer to the best explanation. In other words, there are many possible ways of explaining this. We have to make that very difficult judgment, which is actually the best of these. And the real difficulty I find, and certainly I appreciate your concern at this point, is that evidence takes us thus far. But then when it comes to deciding between a number of competing explanations, it is extremely difficult to have an evidence-driven argument for those final stages. So what I'd want to say is that I believe faith is rational in the sense that it tries to make the best possible sense of things. But in the end, it has to move beyond that, saying, even though we believe this is the best way of making sense of things, we can't actually prove this is the case. And therefore, although I believe faith is rational in the sense that it gives the best possible case it can give, there is a point in which it goes beyond the evidence. And it's at that point, I think, that your concern that it might be irrational, I think, comes into play.
I suppose I would say that at that point where it goes beyond the evidence, that's when it becomes faith. And before that, it isn't faith at all. It's using evidence in the proper way that evidence should be used.
I think I take your point. I think what I'd want to say is that evidence perhaps leads to some probabilistic judgment. There is a possibility there might be a God. But the question is, how do we actually confirm that? Yeah. And there is a sense in which I think one has to say, in the end, we have to make a decision of some sort. There is none, we can't make a decision, or there is a God. And in the end, I think that means stepping out in a degree of faith, whether that is to say there is no God and we'll act on that basis, or whether we decide there is a God and we'll try and act on that basis.
Of course, I totally agree with you. We've got to talk probabilities. Nobody can be certain one way or the other. I think there is a tendency for people to say something like this. You cannot disprove the existence of God. Therefore, that immediately jumps us to 50-50, as though there was some sort of even-Steven probability, simply because you can neither prove nor disprove. Now, I think we'd both agree that we don't want to jump to 50-50, that there are all sorts of probabilities that lie between 0 and 100 and which are not necessarily 50. Now, my attempt to get there is another thing that you've criticized quite strongly, and that is to say that there is an inherent improbability in living things, in the complexity of living things, the statistical improbability of living things. It's something, after all, that creationists from Paley down have played upon. And I want to say exactly the same thing of a designer of any kind, because it seems to me that any entity, any being capable of designing a universe or an eye or a knee would have to be the kind of entity, I don't know in detail, of course, but would have to be the kind of entity which would be statistically improbable in the same kind of way as the eye is. You strongly object to that, apparently on the grounds that Christian theologians don't say that. And I accept maybe they don't. But my question is, why don't they?
Well, I think there's some very good points being made here. I mean, certainly I wouldn't say that simply because there is a possibility there may be God and a possibility there may not be God. It's a 50-50 situation. I think that we are in a situation of when we can't actually prove something decisively either way, we do have to try and make a judgment to the best of our abilities and what the probabilities are. But I think we need to say that you can make a probable judgment cognitively. In other words, I think the evidence points this way, but existentially I feel I can commit myself to this. So I think there's a tension between the probabilistic side of things and being able to actually live a life as a response to that. And then you make a good point, which I think is that this therefore raises the question of the extreme improbability of God. And certainly you've made that point well in your writings. I think one of the responses I would want to make, though, would be this. Perhaps God is extremely improbable. I mean, it is very difficult to actually arrive at an agreement on what this might be. But in the end, I think the ultimate question is going to be improbable or probable. The real question is there a God? And I think that is one of the problems I find, that there is a limit to there's a limit to the position to which probabilistic arguments can take us. In that, in one sense, statistically, you and I are very improbable, and yet we're both here having this very interesting conversation. And so in one sense, there is this very difficult judgment about, given the fact that it may be improbable, does that actually mean that this is not the case?
We are indeed very, very improbable. Because we're so improbable, and all the rest of living things are improbable, we desperately need an explanation which explains that improbability. Now, as you know, evolution by natural selection does exactly that. It does indeed start from very, very simple beginnings, maybe not ultimately simple, but at least much, much simpler beginnings than anything which is produced. And the elegance of the theory is that over millions, billions of years, you get a gradual mounting up of the staircase of improbability. And it all happens gradually. It never makes too big demands, too formidable demands upon our credulity. The sudden conjuring into existence of you or me, or any part of us, would indeed make unreasonable demands on our concept of chance. It couldn't happen. We really, really need a theory which starts from simplicity and makes complexity, makes improbability by gradual degrees. That, as we both agree, is what evolution does. Now, the point where we seem to slightly part company is that I think the same must apply to God. Now, you've said correctly that I can't put a figure on it. I can't put a figure on the eye either. But everybody agrees intuitively that the eye is far too improbable to have suddenly jumped into existence. And I want to say the same about God, and you don't, and I don't understand why not.
I think we have a very interesting disagreement here. And one of the points I'd like to try and make is that although it's difficult to understand, that in one sense the Christian understanding of God is above rather than within the natural process. And therefore for me, God is not so much someone who needs to be explained as someone who actually gives a ground of explanation. And so going back to this whole question of how we arrive at any decision about this, I often go back to C.S. Lewis, who once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not simply because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And Lewis's point there, which I think I find quite persuasive, is that belief in a God actually gives you a way of seeing the world, which actually makes an awful lot of sense of it. Now, you'd rightly come back and say, well, you know, that does not prove anything. And I concede that point. But nevertheless, I believe that one of the questions we have to face here is what worldview, what way of seeing things actually enables us to make most sense of what we see around us and the implications for our lives. And so in that sense, I would want to say that I invoke God not as something within the natural order, but rather as something that actually makes more sense of the natural order than otherwise might be the case.
Sounds a bit to me like a sort of intellectual conjuring trick. I mean, you kind of conceded the point, but then said, well, if you believe in God, it illuminates everything else. And I could well imagine, for example, that it doesn't just illuminate the natural world for you, but illuminates a kind of internal world where you feel a subjective awareness which you can make sense of by assuming God. However, I think that's moderately weak, and it's even weaker when you're talking about the natural world, because you're still left with my point that it's not just that we don't need God in order to explain the natural world, but he's positively improbable for exactly the same reason as the sudden conjuring into existence of an eye is improbable. So what I'm saying is that the argument of the creationists, and I know you're not one of them, but their argument actually backfires very badly, because the ultimately complex entity, and he has to be even more complex if he's going to do the rest of what you require him to do, which is to illuminate your path, illuminate your internal feelings, to say nothing of answering prayers and forgiving sins and all that kind of thing, plus making a universe. He's really got to be far, far more complicated than an eye, and therefore it's not just that we don't need him to explain the world because we've got evolution. He is improbable for exactly the same reason as the sudden jumping into existence of living complexity was improbable before we understood Darwinism. I mean, if you believed in a God who evolved,
I'd be much happier if you said, well, somewhere out in Alpha Centauri, there's a superior form of life which is so immensely superior to us that we would call it God, and maybe it even seeded life here, and maybe it beams rays here to protect us and forgive our sins and all that sort of thing. I'd be much happier with that, because I could then say, well, the God actually evolved, and therefore we are no longer bereft of an explanation for his existence. But I don't think you do believe that.
I think there's some very interesting points there. I think the first point I'd want to make simply is this. I mean, it's not as if I believe in God because I think he's a good explanation. It's actually I believe in God for a number of reasons, and I find there's this explanatory bonus to us. In other words, that believing in God does give me a way of making sense of things, even though I don't actually think that's the primarily important thing about him. But then you make some very interesting points again about the complexity of God, about where God comes from and so on. And again, those are significant points which must be talked about. But one of the observations I've made is that in talking to natural scientists, I mean, if we look at the split between religious believers and those who don't believe, I mean, it's roughly 50-50 with obviously a number undecided. And so I think I would have to say I don't find the case for atheism compelling on the grounds of natural science at all. I think the issue, as you put, of where God comes from is a very significant question. But from a Christian perspective, that isn't really the question that is to be asked. The idea is that God was there before everything, and in some way God makes things in some way. And as a result of that is the ground of explanation. But as a Christian, I don't need to invoke God to explain why this TV camera works, why things fall from the earth in certain ways. It's much more I understand God to have made a framework which actually is regular and can be understood. And therefore, actually, in one sense, we have this very interesting historical observation that in some way Christianity may have catalyzed the emergence of the natural sciences by stressing the regularity of the created order, and thus it's in fact it's so amenable to scientific investigation and scientific explanation.
That, of course, could be a historically valid point, and I don't know enough history to judge. When you say God didn't come into existence but was always there, I find that not really very helpful, because, suppose I go back to my problem of explaining the eye. It would be no kind of answer to say, the eye was always there. It would still be something that requires explanation in the sense that anything statistically improbable does. So I don't think you could get away with it with an eye. And I don't really see why you can get away with it with God. I know that there are other theologians who have attempted to say, to deny the proposition that God is complex at all. There have been some theologians who have suggested that God is ultimately simple. And that would be fine as far as explaining his existence is concerned. I could easily believe that an ultimately simple God's always existed. But then he would not be capable of doing what we expect of him, which is setting up the laws of the universe. And as I said before, to say nothing of all the things like listening to prayers, which require a different order of complexity, but certainly can't be done by anything that's ultimately simple.
Again, you've raised some very interesting questions. And again, you've highlighted some tensions inside Christian theology. And certainly the way of approaching things that I would want to adopt would be this: not to begin with a predetermined or preconceived idea of God. God must be simple or God must be complex, but rather to try and infer what God must be like on the basis of what God has done or in terms of what God has revealed himself to be. And thus, I think the points you make actually might be driven to some extent by a preconceived idea of what God must be like. But I think the whole issue of the emergence of time and so forth does raise some very, very difficult questions. A perfectly reasonable point we might discuss is where was the universe before it actually began? Because certainly I think the issue here is simply the capacity of the human mind to comprehend some extremely counterintuitive ideas. And I certainly have difficulties in relation to some of these in thinking about God, but I notice they are also there in standard physical accounts of how the universe actually came into being, which require us to think of a time when there was no universe, or indeed think of modern cosmological theories, think of the universe expanding into something. It's a very, very difficult idea to grasp, but for that reason is not wrong.
I agree with that, and I totally agree with you that there's deep, deep mystery at the base of the universe, and physicists know this as well as anybody. Questions like, what, if anything, was there before time began? Perhaps it's because I am a biologist who has been impressed through my whole career by the power of evolution, that the one thing I would not be happy about accepting in those deeply mysterious preconditions of the universe is anything complex. I could easily imagine something very hard to understand at the base of the universe, at the base of the laws of physics. And of course, they are very hard to understand. But the one thing that seems to me clearly doesn't help is to postulate anything in the nature of a complicated intelligence. There are lots of things that would help, and physicists are working on them, and theories of everything and that kind of thing. But a theory which begins by postulating a deliberate conscious intelligence seems to me to have sold the past right before you even start, because that's one of the things that science has so triumphantly explained. Science hasn't triumphantly explained yet the origin of the universe, but I have a very strong intuition, and I wish I could persuade you of it, that science is not going to be helped by invoking conscious, deliberate intelligence. Whatever else preceded the universe, whatever that might mean, it is not going to be the kind of thing which designs anything, let alone the kind of thing which dies for people's sins.
I think one point I want to try and make here is that it is extremely difficult to extrapolate into the very distant past and actually work out what must have happened. I mean, certainly I understand the Darwinian paradigm and so forth. And yet in one sense, I think that religion is primarily concerned not so much with explanation of origins, but much more with the way things are now. How can we give an account of them? And above all, I think, how we should live, how we should think in the present. And I think that an appeal to how things came into being is actually a relatively small part of that. It may become significant for polemical reasons, but actually in terms of the constructive way in which religious people think about the world, really the primary emphasis is not so much on looking backwards as looking at things as they are right now and trying to say, what is the best way of making sense of these things? How should we live? What is a way of thinking, a way of acting that really gives us an understanding of the way things are, but also a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason to die, and so forth?
Yes, and of course we all want those things, and we all want to discuss morality, the right way to live. But religion does make claims about existence, which don't seem to me to be essential for the moral good life that you're talking about. And Christianity might very well be a guide for a good life, but or indeed Judaism might be, or Islam might be. But I can't see how that has any bearing upon the existence claims. And maybe you're almost saying that doesn't matter to you, that that's a less important thing than the way things are now and the way we ought to live now. From what you were saying before, I could imagine that you would be some sort of a deist, some sort of a believer in an ultimate prime mover, although I would depart from you there as well. But I don't understand why you're a Christian. I mean, that Christianity has got an enormous amount added onto that, as you just implied. The idea of redemption, the idea of atonement, the idea of original sin, the idea of forgiveness, the idea of prayer. These things seem to have no substantiating basis at all, and yet you've grafted them on. One would be tempted to say, for no better reason than that that's the way you happen to have been brought up.
Well, I think you've raised a very important question, and it really allows me, I think, to be able to amplify some of the things I've been saying thus far. I think what I'd want to say is that, in the end, one of the key reasons why I believe in God has to do with Jesus. And therefore, for a Christian, one of the central themes is going to be what actually happened in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and what is its meaning. Because for Christians, it's not simply abstract thinking about a God. I mean, I believe in a God very, very strongly, but the reason I believe in God is not reflection on the way the world is, or indeed sort of theoretical reflection on the idea of God. There's actually actually this very focused concentration on the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, because in that I see something which really holds the key to everything. And for me, if I may just overstate very slightly, one of the key reasons for Christians believing in God is actually Jesus, because we see there something which demands explanation. And that really, I think, is the ultimate ground of faith for a Christian, rather than more abstract reflection about God. Now, you rightly then make points about me possibly adding on things about redemption, original sin, and so forth. But actually, I would say I don't. That in fact, these are all core ideas. And in fact, that in one sense, the idea I add on is not so much Jesus' life, death, resurrection, the idea of forgiveness, the idea of Jesus' relevance for us, but actually that the explanatory capacity of the idea of God, for me, emerges from this. I then bring that to bear on the sciences, but it's not actually the primary reason why I believe in God. If you like, it's a very significant and very welcome addition, but it is not the primary focus in my view. If you like, Christianity is not so much about explanation, but about salvation. But it turns out that the Christian vision of salvation does have explanatory implications.
But the evidence for the life of Jesus and what he did, historically speaking, is remarkably thin. Modern theologians surely agree about that, don't they?
Well, I think that there are obvious questions about how we can have reliable historical knowledge about such a distant figure. And yet the New Testament dates from remarkably close to the time of Jesus, much closer than, for example, standard Roman biographies of emperors. And anyway, it's not so much really the details of the biography. It is the way in which Jesus' life was perceived to have certain significance by his first followers, which resonated with their experience and moved forward from there. And so I think we're dealing with something which actually was seen to be significant and was seen to be capable of transforming people's lives. Now, obviously, the point you'd want to make is this must be interrogated concerning its reliability. But certainly as you read the New Testament and the early history of Christianity, you can see people convinced that something of decisive importance has happened, which has the capacity not simply to transform their lives, but also to explain what they see in the world around them.
Right. Obviously, one of those central points is the idea of original sin and redemption. As I understand it, sin is supposed to have been, in some sense, paid for by the death of Jesus, the torture and death of Jesus. Someone coming to that from outside might think it was a really rather unpleasant doctrine, because we have the idea of punishment as a way of expiating sin, which has some unpleasant aspects to it. It also has the idea of punishing somebody else for the sins that he didn't commit. It has the idea of, at least in some theologies, punishing him for a sin which was committed by a man, Adam, who didn't even exist. In other theologies, it includes the idea of expiating sins which have yet to be committed in the future, whether or not we future people choose to commit them. And finally, one's left with a sort of slightly mischievous feeling, well, who was he trying to impress anyway? Because after all, if he was one of the manifestations of God, if he wanted to forgive us our sins, why didn't he just forgive them instead of going through all that self-torture?
I think you've raised a lot of questions there, and you've rightly said theologians differ slightly. The point I'd want to make would be this, that what Christianity is saying is that there seems something wrong with human nature, that we just don't possess the capacity to transform ourselves, that in some way, in order to experience and enter into the redeemed life, something has to be done for us. It's a question of not having the adequate resources to actually transform ourselves to be saved. And therefore the Christian understanding is that in some way, the life and above all the death and resurrection of Jesus are the basis for this transformation. Now, obviously, theologians disagree, but a very key theme is that in some way, by entering into the world in Christ, God is demonstrating our the extent to which we have wandered from him, and also his yearning or longing that we should actually come back to him. So for me, the death of Christ is about God demonstrating love for us, bringing home to us how far we are from us, but also, if you like, making it possible for us to return to him, to relate to him, with the removal of barriers such as sin or guilt which stand in his way. And so for that reason, Christians have very often, rightly, I think, thought of the death and resurrection of Christ as being right at the center of the Christian faith, because it is at this point, if you like, that this great act of redemption has taken place, and which we're being asked to respond to in some way.
But it's almost as though you're slipping away from the factual veracity of this and erecting the death of Jesus as almost a kind of poetic, symbolic act. And I've noticed a tendency for theologians to do that a lot and to sort of almost say, we don't care what really happened. What matters is the symbolic meaning. It's almost as though if, say, at some future date, the double helix model of DNA were ever to be disproved, and then if scientists had become so religiously committed to the idea of the double helix that they would say something like, we don't care whether it's actually true that it's a double helix, but what meaning does the double helix have for us today? Perhaps the affinity of the bases for each other, the purine for the pyrimidine, the way the double helix coils round itself has meaning for us in terms of a loving relationship. You get the point. I mean, doesn't it actually rather matter that this man was tortured and killed for somebody else's sins, when if he was God, he had the power simply to forgive them or perform some other symbolic act, rather than actually be crucified in this horrendous way?
I think for Christians, the events you've described, the actualities, are immensely important. But I think every event actually needs to be interpreted. In other words, this has happened, was its significance? For example, Caesar crossing the Rubicon is actually more than just a general crossing a river. It is an act of declaration of war against Rome because of its significance. And therefore, what Christians have tried to do is to say there are these events, and here are their significance. So the event, if you like, is the death of Jesus on the cross. Its significance is the demonstration of God's love, the transformation of the human situation, the forgiveness of sins, and so forth. And certainly I wouldn't want to minimize for one moment the pain that Christ suffered, the apparent torture, as you rightly say, he went through. And from a Christian perspective, that is not about glorifying torture. It's not about in any way saying, let's do to other people what they did to Jesus. It's much more saying, look, in Christ we see God entering into the world at its darkest parts. The worst that the world could do, the punishment of Christ, his rejection, his torture, his agony, his death, and so on, then in some sense God entered into those darkest parts of the world in order to redeem it. And certainly, you mentioned earlier I might have been a deist. I hope I'm not, because a deist would simply take the view that God is up there looking down on things, perhaps benignly. But the kind of God I believe in is a God who actually enters into this world, takes on this world at its worst in order to try and transform it. And that really is part of this gospel of redemption, that in some way God chose to enter this world to bring about its transformation through Christ.
I understand what you believe. I wish I understood why. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.